thank you to our witnesses for being here today and for your patience. This hearing, entitled Russia in the Western Hemisphere, assessing, assessing Putin's malign influence in Latin America and the Caribbean, will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, strenuous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRS 8 and the accompanying regulation, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I now recognize myself for opening remarks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying before our committee today. The world has watched in horror as Putin's war rages on in the Ukraine. His willingness to sacrifice countless lives in his selfish pursuit of regional dominance has caused a humanitarian crisis that will long outlive the conflict. Nonetheless, several Latin American governments have expressed apathy or even explicit support for the Russian invasion. Even as the shocking images of civilian graves and flattened cities capture our attention and animosity, we must pay attention to Putin's influence in our own backyard. Russia has steadily shored up its presence in Latin America and the Caribbean, threatening democratic aspirations and developing goals. Putin has found close friends in the region's most brutal dictatorships, including the leaders in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, and has made overtures to U.S. allies such as Brazil and Argentina. As I have said many times before during my tenure in Congress, the United States must not pivot away from Latin America because Putin is eager to step in. We must also be careful not to conflate Russia and China's action or share of influence in the region. While China funds infrastructure and creates financial ties with our neighbors, Russia has to use more creative methods to garner influence. Our strategy has been to spread misinformation. One strategy has been to spread misinformation by broadcasting Spanish language Kremlin propaganda through RT and Sputnik. Russia also sells arms and artillery that only its engineers can maintain and provides critical intelligence support, fostering security interdependence that is difficult to unravel. Finally, Russia has painstakingly constructed a global sanctions evasion network, undermining the coercive power of the U.S. financial restrictions intended to modify the behavior of human rights abusers around the world. The Russian government's actions are supported by other non-state actors, including cyber operatives. In the wake of Putin's attack on Ukraine, the Russian-based hackers group Conti announced full support for action and that they would attack those who responded to the invasion. The results of Putin's project have been outstanding. Venezuela, dictator Nicolás Maduro, Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega, and Miguel Díaz-Canel of Cuba have amplified Russian talking points on the invasion of Ukraine. All three have welcomed Russian security personnel to train their own forces and engage in military exercises. Granted Russian access to cybersecurity and intelligence networks, and prioritized their bilateral relationship with the Kremlin at the expense of regional institutions like the Organization of the American States. Russia's support has empowered client regimes to step up surveillance, election rigging, and political persecution, dealing a blow to the efforts of pro-democracy activists. This trend of Russian interference cannot be expected to diminish in the coming years. Putin will continue to seek and support like-minded authoritarian partners who maintain power by suppressing the opposition. Russian disinformation will continue to inflame political polarization and civil disorder. Countless regional objectives, from climate change mitigation to anti-corruption, will be obstructed in favor of Russian priorities. Today's hearing will allow us to come together to examine these steps we can and must take to combat Russian malign influence in the Western Hemisphere. We are presented with an opportunity to have an in-depth, constructive conversation on the impact of Russian overtures to our neighbors in the Caribbean and in Latin America. It is my sincere hope that all members here today will engage in a good faith effort to further our policy response in a way that best serves U.S. interests and the principles of our nation that we stand for. Our witnesses have prepared detailed testimony that I believe will be very valuable to this subcommittee work. Once again, I thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to a productive hearing. I will now recognize Ranking Member Green for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Siris, my friend from New Jersey, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. Today's hearing on Russia's malign influence in the Western Hemisphere is increasingly pertinent in light of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Since the beginning of the invasion, Putin's influence has only grown in Latin America and the Caribbean. Many governments on all sides of the ideologic spectrum have failed to address Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For instance, El Salvador was one of the countries that abstained from a UN vote condemning Russia's invasion, and Mexico's president has consistently telegraphed his neutrality. Worse, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela shamelessly supported Putin ahead of the invasion. Even more concerning, to date, no country has implemented sanctions against Putin, his cronies, or Russia's war machine. This is truly disappointing. One of the ways in which Russia exercises its malign influence in the region is through its Spanish-language version of Russia Today, also known as RT. This propaganda outlet operates in almost every Latin American and Caribbean country. In addition to Moscow-controlled Sputnik News, RT spreads anti-American disinformation and false flag narratives to justify Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Russia has also turned to the region in an effort to dodge Western sanctions. The U.S. intelligence community's 2022 annual threat assessment states that Russia has, quote, expanded its engagement with Venezuela, supported Cuba, and used arms sales and energy agreements to try to expand access to markets and natural resources in Latin America, in part to offset some of the effects of sanctions, end quote. Russia has even gone so far as to threaten the possibility of sending military assets to Latin America if the United States and our allies do not halt our assistance to Ukraine. This is unacceptable. In its 2022 posture statement, Southcom asserts that Russia is among the secondary external threats in the Western Hemisphere, with China being the primary threat. Southcom states that Russia, and I quote, intensifies instability through its ties with Venezuela, entrenchment in Cuba and Nicaragua, and extensive disinformation operations, end quote. The oppressive regimes of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are without doubt the largest sources of instability in the region, and they all have Russian and Chinese ties. In fact, the U.S. commander of NORTHCOM recently revealed that our neighbor Mexico has the largest number of Russian intelligence officers. Meanwhile, our southern border remains wide open. Congress cannot stand idly by while the Russian and the Chinese regimes ramp up their malign activities in the region. For too long, the Western Hemisphere has taken a back seat in U.S. foreign policy. We've seen the disastrous consequences of this, from China's debt trap diplomacy to Taiwan's growing diplomatic isolation, to Russia's arms sales and military engagement, to rising instability and surging migration. The absence of American leadership in our hemisphere has created a vacuum, and this vacuum has been filled by Russia and China. Congress must act. The administration must act. As a House Armed Services Committee member, I'm proud of securing several of my key priorities in the House-passed FY 2023 NDAA. One of these priorities includes my amendment requiring a Department of Defense report addressing Russia's malign activity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Uncovering these activities will help policymakers better address them and will shed light on Russia's hostile actions. As ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, I introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation, the Western Hemisphere Nearshoring Act, with the assistance of Chairman Cirrus and his staff. This legislation would offer Latin America and Caribbean countries an alternative to China's debt trap diplomacy and Russia's backhanded deals. By nearshoring manufacturing jobs from China to our hemisphere, we can reduce our region's dependence on China and increase economic opportunity. It's a big step towards re-engaging with our southern neighbors, economically, politically, and diplomatically. And I want to take a moment and thank the State Department for their bipartisan assistance in writing this legislation. I ask all of my colleagues to co-sponsor this common sense legislation and would respectfully urge Chairman Meeks to schedule the bill for markup soon. In closing, Mr. Chairman, it's unthinkable that in a region where nearly every single country was a signatory in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, we're witnessing so many democratic partners ignoring Russia's horrific human rights violations. The Charter solidified the region's commitment to democratic norms and principles. Our partners cannot continue ignoring Putin's malign and destabilizing behavior. Again, I want to deeply thank Chairman Cirrus for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you, and I yield.
With Dr. Vladimir Rovinsky. Got that right?
Good afternoon, Chairman.
Well, Dr. Rovinsky, you got a lot of stuff here. That's all good. Let me read it.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Rovinsky is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Laboratory for Politics and International Relations at Icesi University in California. In addition to coordinating the Pacific Alliance Studies program, he graduated from Irkutsk State University in Russia and earned his Ph.D. from Hiroshima University in Japan. His primary area of expertise is Russian relations with the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition to several publications on the topic, Dr. Rovinsky has also held research positions at the Wilson Center, Florida International University, and Institute in Germany. Dr. Rovinsky, we welcome you to the hearing. I ask witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes without objection. Your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Rovinsky, you are recognized for your testimony. Vladimir, you're on. Can you hear me? Mr.
Yes,
Rovinsky, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We have a problem with your audio. Can you turn it on? Is it on? There you go.
Yes. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Chairman Sears, Ranking Member Green, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's truly a privilege for me to address you today on the issues related to Russia's engagement in the Western Hemisphere. And in today's testimony, I would like to summarize the key points of my written statement, and I will focus on the long-term objectives of Russia in this part of the world, Moscow preferred modus operandi, in addition to evaluating the impact of the war in Ukraine on Russia's relationship with Latin America, and I will offer some policy recommendations on mitigating Russia's malign influence in the region. Let me begin by explaining why Latin America matters to Russia. Putin's war in Ukraine reconfirmed that Russia's ruling elites consider the territory of the former Soviet Union as the most important geographical area for Moscow outside Russia's borders. At the same time, Moscow views the entire Western Hemisphere as the U.S. crucial area of security, political, economic, and social concern. And from this perspective, Putin's strategy towards Latin America and the Caribbean is guided mostly by the logic of reciprocity, which has multiple manifestations in Russia's foreign policy. First, it is an opportunity for Putin's government to show that Russia can respond reciprocally to the U.S. support to the governments that have decided to advance their independent domestic and foreign policy agenda in Russia's neighboring countries. That is why, in Latin America, under the rule of Vladimir Putin, Russia prioritized strengthening political relations with the former Soviet allies like Cuba and Nicaragua, in addition to those regimes in the Western Hemisphere, which narratives had been openly anti-American, like Venezuela. For the last 20 years, Russia has been using various means to support its allies in Latin America: arms trade, limited but timely financial assistance, diplomatic backing in the United Nations and other multilateral forums, and facilitating sanctions evasion. Second, another pillar of Russia's Latin American policy is strategic communication via an extensive network of government-controlled media outlets such as RT in Spanish, RT Actualidad, and Sputnik news agency, Sputnik Mundo, as were mentioned today already. RT Actualidad and Sputnik Mundo's narrative not only emphasize the role of Russia as a global player, but they also always stress that the United States resists the process of Russia regaining so-called due place in the international arena and opposes building a new multipolar order with the participation of Latin American partners. Moreover, most of the programs aired by RT misinform viewers regarding the policy of the United States and Latin America on such sensitive issues as migration, liberal democracy, and economic and social issues. As a result of the implementation of Putin's strategy, as the war in Ukraine was unfolding, many Latin American leaders experienced difficulties finding a way to distance themselves from Russia. The lack of consensus among important Latin American nations on the Russian war in Ukraine benefited Moscow by offering the Kremlin an opportunity to claim that the United States and the Western powers failed to achieve isolation of Russia in the international arena. However, at the same time, in many other aspects, I believe that the continuation of Russia's strategy toward the region is facing today severe challenges. One of them is the significantly reduced capacity of Moscow to offer attractive incentives for foreign trade and economic cooperation for Latin American countries, including Putin's traditional allies like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, because of the war-related cost and the impact of the economic sanctions on Russia. The other is the decreasing capacity to continue providing political backing in the international arena to some Latin American nations, as well as to engage them in diplomatic activities, since the government of Vladimir Putin has to cope with the growing international isolation of Russia itself. Against this background, I think that the Russian war in Ukraine's impact on Latin America offers the United States new opportunities. One of them is to review the previous approaches to deal with the political regimes that serve as Russia's gateway to the region. Since Moscow's capacity to provide economic and political support to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba have significantly diminished, they may be willing to adopt new strategy in their bilateral relations with the United States. This is particularly evident, I believe, in the case of Venezuela, where a limited U.S. engagement in the energy sector could become a game changer and eventually reduce other threats to security in the region, including illegal drug trafficking and the refugee crisis. Besides, the reactivation of the oil sector will likely alleviate the living conditions of ordinary Venezuelans and pave the way for a possible power transition in Venezuela. Similarly, this step would improve U.S. energy security and directly benefit U.S. companies. In the case of other Latin American nations, it is essential to keep in mind that one of the factors that allowed Russia to advance its Latin American policy is the use of the narrative of building a new world order, which allegedly could benefit Latin America, combined with the perception held by many Latin Americans that the region is no more a priority for the United States. In this context, I think that introducing a coordinated U.S.-Latin American communication strategy, emphasizing the value of shared U.S.-Latin American interests, combined with, for example, high-level public events, will make it more difficult for Russia to continue exploiting anti-American sentiments here. On top of that, broad information coverage of U.S.-Latin American cooperation in cybersecurity, countering transnational organized crime, and offsetting, for example, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing would help stress the value of having Americans as friends for Latin America, for both elites and ordinary Latin Americans. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that the war in Ukraine showed that the regime of Vladimir Putin seeks not to help build new world order, but to carry out an expansionist agenda of Russian contemporary political elites. That is why an information strategy that aims to challenge the Russian narrative, combined with public diplomacy and strengthen civil society, could seize opportunities for successful disinformation campaigns regularly conducted by Moscow through their government-controlled media outlets and Russian embassies. I thank the subcommittee for this opportunity to share my views, and I look forward to a question.
Thank you very much. I will now introduce Dr. Kimberly Marten. Dr. Marten is a professor of political science at Barnard College, specializing in international relations, international security, and Russia. She is a faculty and executive committee member of Columbia's Harriman Institute for Russian and Eurasian and East European Studies and Salzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. She holds a degree from Harvard and Stanford and earned the Marshall Schulman Prize for her 1993 book, Engaging the Enemy, Organization Theory and Soviet Military Innovation. Her many publications have analyzed Russian private military activities in Africa, Russia-NATO relations, and Russian intelligence operations under Putin. She is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and International Institute for Strategic Studies, and is a founding member of Pornos Eurasia. Dr. Marten, we welcome you to the hearing. I ask the witness to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Marten, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Stedes. Chairman Stedes, Ranking Member Green, and distinguished opportunity to testify and to share my analysis of Russia's military and economic interests and influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. My written testimony includes a lot more detailed information and examples. In the 5 minutes I have here, I will summarize my overall conclusions and provide my policy recommendations. Since 2014, Russia has explicitly tried to undermine U.S. interests and influence among its Latin American and Caribbean neighbors in direct payback for Washington's support of Ukraine. President Putin tries to attract any country that feels slighted by the United States while taking advantage of lingering historical fears about U.S. and Western imperialism. He also seeks to entangle Russian state security interests with private commercial deals for his network cronies and cooperates with global organized crime in doing so. Yet Russian efforts in the Western Hemisphere have faced real limits, including growing competition from China. Russia's malign activities near U.S. borders and along the sea lanes that support U.S. defense and commerce must be closely monitored. But we must not overreact to what is often more rhetoric than reality. Russia's presence lacks the deep ideological roots of the Cold War era. Russia has also faced reputational concerns about its reliability as a partner, aggravated by its COVID vaccine diplomacy mistakes. Russian weaknesses provide an opportunity for U.S. diplomacy to chip away at Russian influence. Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have airports and seaports that are reliable transit hubs for the Russian military in Latin America. But their distance from Russia and proximity to the overwhelming military and intelligence presence of U.S. Southcom forces leaves any Russian forces in the region vulnerable to eavesdropping and harassment. Despite recent Russian statements promising significant security cooperation with countries in the region, Moscow's achievements are limited. It has no permanent military bases there. It does have two small facilities in Nicaragua, a counter-narcotics training center operated by the Russian Interior Ministry, and a civilian satellite communications tracking base that may also gather local intelligence against the U.S. and its allies. There is also a helicopter training center that uses flight simulators in Venezuela. Russia often sends military personnel to the region, including to support its long-term weapons contracts, leaving hundreds of Russian military specialists on the ground. Their presence in Venezuela in 2019 may have helped deter a U.S. intervention against Nicolas Maduro. Despite a major push to sell new weapons in the region, Russia has struggled to find buyers. The U.S. and Europe remain the dominant regional weapons suppliers, and in 2018, the U.S. warned its clients they would be cut out of future deals if they bought weapons from Russia. Only 4 countries in the region have received weapons from Russia since 2014, and none since 2017. Russia regularly carries out small-scale military and naval exercises in the region, and Nicaragua's renewal this year of its annual training plan with Russia raised concerns. But this has been going on for 10 years, it's not new, and does not involve any increased Russian presence in the country. We do know that Russia's military intelligence agency, the GRU, has a large presence in Mexico, as Chairman Sires mentioned. This is disturbing because the GRU has led many malign operations in recent years, including election interference and assassination campaigns. Overall, U.S. forces have to prepare for worst-case scenarios, including some kind of Russian military distraction campaign in the Western Hemisphere as the Ukraine war continues. Putin has certainly surprised the world elsewhere, but it seems unlikely that he would risk violent escalation near U.S. borders unless he believed that his regime faced an immediate existential threat from Washington. Leaders with authoritarian or leftist populist leanings who are suspicious of the United States have won democratic elections, sparking concerns about possible avenues for Russian influence. Russia has recently gained diplomatic and rhetorical support from Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. But support for Russia in each of these countries is shallow and politically contested. Their economic ties to Moscow are relatively small and are becoming increasingly inconvenient because of U.S. and global SWIFT banking sanctions on Russia, which have forced them to find more expensive workarounds. Given these Russian efforts and their limits, here are my policy recommendations. The U.S. must carefully observe Russian military activities in the Western Hemisphere and be prepared to react in the event of escalation. The U.S. must stay diplomatically engaged. As of last week, there are 13 U.S. ambassadorial posts vacant in the region. We can offer democratic states trade and investment alternatives to Russia, such as encouraging Brazil's adoption of high-tech alternatives to its fertilizer imports from Russia. We can also offer trade and investment incentives to encourage human rights and democratization efforts among the region's autocratic regimes while wooing them away from Russia, such as recent initiatives to gradually reduce sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector. In the end, the U.S. must avoid overreacting to Russian rhetoric and recognize that it may be China, not Russia, that most threatens U.S. leadership in the region in coming years. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marten. I will now introduce Ms. Candace Rondeaux. Ms. Rondeaux is a director of the Future Frontlines program at the New American Foundation. She is also a professor of practice at the Center of the Future of War in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Additionally, she lectures on conflict studies at Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and serves on Tulane University's Emergency and Security Studies Advisory Board. She writes regularly for World Politics Review and the Daily Beast on the intersection of emerging tech, political violence, and geopolitical competition. Her previous experience includes working at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Office of the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, and the Washington Post. She also holds a degree from Sarah Lawrence College, New York University, and Princeton. Ms. Rondeaux, we welcome you to the hearing. I ask the witness please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Rondeaux, you are recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Sirus, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. And thank you for the opportunity to submit my testimony and appear before you today. A year ago, if you'd asked most Americans what they knew about the Wagner Group and how Russian mercenaries fit into Russia's military strategy, many would probably say they have no idea. The fact that Russia has deployed mercenaries to fight its battles abroad is now almost common knowledge. The Wagner Group's reported involvement in atrocities in Ukraine and in recent months elsewhere has understandably brought newfound attention to atrocities linked to Russian mercenaries and operatives in other parts of the world where Russia has sought to exert influence in places like Africa and the Middle East. However, what is less well known is that Russian mercenaries operate much closer to home in Latin America. Strategically speaking, covert Russian mercenary operations, real and imagined, are critical for Russia's strategy for sanctions evasion and for managing the risks of conflict escalation in places where Russian forces and entities engage in clear violations of international law. Their area of operations encompasses any part of the world where Kremlin-controlled state companies in the fossil fuel, mining, and arms industries have struck deals with local governments and warlords. Tactically speaking, Russian mercenaries run reconnaissance operations, they provide targeting intelligence, military training, logistical support, and backstop proxy militias and Russian military missions in key global hotspots. In the Western Hemisphere, one of those hotspots is Venezuela. In 2019, some 400 Russian mercenaries were deployed to Caracas to provide training and support for the Venezuelan military. Not coincidentally, it is also one of the biggest areas of investment in the world for Rosneft, Russia's leading state-owned oil company. Rosneft, and by association the Russian government, have for years also been one of the largest guarantors of Venezuelan debt. From 2014 to 2019, Rosneft was among the biggest stakeholders in joint oil production projects run by the PDVSA, Venezuela's national oil company. That changed, however, in April 2020, when Rosneft abruptly cut its long-standing ties with PDVSA and sold its stake in Venezuelan oil ventures due to US sanctions against the Venezuelan government. At the time, Rosneft announced that it would be transferring its entire stake to PDVSA to another largely unknown Russian state-backed firm known as Roszarubezhneft. The new man in charge of managing Russia's distressed Venezuelan energy assets, Nikolai Rybchuk, happened to be a former Spetsnaz special forces officer with next to no experience in the energy industry, but plenty of experience fighting alongside paramilitaries in places like Angola. Fast forward to March of this year, a month after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and only days after the US and EU imposed sanctions on Russian oil, it appears Russia's stake in Venezuelan oil has once again changed hands to another Russian company called Petromost. Just a quick check of the information about Petromost company records and archive web pages reveals that Petromost is actually a front company for the security arm of Rosneft. This shell game business is business as usual for Rosneft and for Russia. Russia has consistently denied that it has hired guns for working in Venezuela and other places in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, but deniability is rather the point of the mythology surrounding the Wagner Group and Russian mercenaries. On paper, many of the deals Russia makes with strongmen like Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro can be traced back to the owners of Russian front companies who have ties to the Kremlin. But in practice, it is Russia's President Vladimir Putin and the presidentially appointed heads of state-owned companies like Rosneft, Rostec, Russia's state arms company, and others who reap the benefits of Russian mercenary operations. The Wagner Group is not a private military security company in the classic sense, and comparisons with US firms like Blackwater are a complete misnomer. In fact, the most apt comparison for the Wagner Group and Russian mercenary networks is not Blackwater, but Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. For decades, the Sinaloa cartel has operated like a hybrid terrorist organization, setting up front companies, evading law enforcement, and killing anyone who is perceived as getting in the way of the cartel's illicit trade. Like the Sinaloa cartel, Russian mercenaries rely on a web of legal and black market relationships to traffic in illicit goods and trade with sanctioned companies and individuals where their chief financiers in Russia launder the money on those deals. The only difference between the Sinaloa cartel and Russian military contractors is that while the businesses involved in Sinaloa are all ostensibly private, in the Russian case, they are nominally private on paper. In the Russian case, security agencies such as the FSB and GRU and other organs of the Russian state are involved in every aspect of the military cartel's operations, from recruitment to deployment to the battlefield. The US and EU have sanctioned the Wagner Group and individuals suspected of being involved in Russian mercenary operations, but it is not entirely clear what effect those moves have had on constraining Russia's deployments of mercenary contingents. More recently, some experts have called for the United States to designate the Wagner Group as a foreign terrorist organization, a move that would prohibit provision of material support to Russian mercenaries going forward. Given the lack of substantive and effective policy action on the problem dealing with Russian mercenaries to date, designating the Wagner Group a terrorist organization sounds like a great idea. But one problem is that the Wagner Group doesn't exist, and that to do so, the US is going to need to change its approach and understanding of the threat posed by Russian mercenary operations. If the US wants to get a better handle on this challenge, it's going to need to do two things: learn the problem set and right-size the strategy for managing it. The first step on that path to learning the problem set is to treat it for what it is: Russian state-backed organized crime cartel that often operates like a terrorist group. The second step is not that different from measures we've seen the US intelligence and law enforcement agencies take in the past when dealing with organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or like the Sinaloa cartel. With concerted effort, the shell companies that make up this covert network of Russian mercenaries and their operatives and clients can often be traced through bills of lading, customs and trade data, and other open sources that are publicly available to anyone who cares to explore them. To do that, however, the US will need to establish the institutional architecture needed for the US and its allies to share continual streams of real-time intelligence on the movements of Russian mercenary operations and contingents around the world, but particularly in the Western Hemisphere. It will also mean the US national security agencies involved in this effort need to be thinking creatively about broadening information sharing beyond the traditional intelligence agency and law enforcement routes. In the longer term, it will also require high-level diplomatic efforts to persuade US partners around the world that Russia's continued ability to evade sanctions and profit from the illicit provision of embargoed goods and services will only aid Putin's regime. To make progress on all of the above, you're going to need to work hard, and this may seem like a tall order from Washington's point of view, but it is the only way to get to grips with the problem of Russia's aggression. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Rondeaux. Thank you very much. I will now introduce our final witness, Dr. Evan Ellis. Dr. Ellis is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, with a focus on region's relationship with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. He has published over 360 works, including 5 books, and previously served on the Secretary of State's Policy and Planning staff, with the responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the international narcotic and law enforcement. Dr. Ellis is a senior associate in the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and has been awarded the Order of Military Merit Jose Maria Cordova by the government of Colombia. Dr. Ellis, we welcome you to the hearing, and I ask witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes without objection. Your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Ellis, you are recognized.
Chairman Sayers, Ranking Member Green, distinguished subcommittee members, I am honored to share my analysis with you today. I will summarize my written testimony. To begin, Russia has demonstrated its intent and its capability, although limited, to conduct military activities oriented against the U.S. and our partners in the Western Hemisphere. Its key vehicle for doing so has been anti-U.S. authoritarian regimes, specifically Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Recent examples of such Russian threat projection include a pact to increase military cooperation with Venezuela and sending a Russian team of snipers to an upcoming military competition in Venezuela in August. Russia has also supported Venezuelan forces headed to the state of Apure, provided and maintained S-300 air defense systems in Venezuela, and sent at least 100 military trainers and technicians, as well as the just mentioned Wagner Group mercenaries, to Venezuela. Russia has also sent its nuclear-capable Tu-160 backfire bombers to Venezuela on multiple occasions. in September 2008, October 2013, and December 2018. It has deployed warships to Venezuela in 2008, and it has threatened to establish a military base on La Archila Island off the coast of Venezuela. Since 2006, Russia has sold Venezuela $11.4 billion in military goods. In Nicaragua, the Ortega regime authorized 230 Russian troops, as previously mentioned, plus aircraft, ships, and weapons to operate in the country. As with Venezuela, Russia has deployed its nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Nicaragua on multiple occasions. Russian military aircraft have also repeatedly violated Colombian airspace from Nicaragua as well as from Venezuela, including incursions in October and November 2013, in August 2019, in April 2020, in July 2020, and again in April 2021. Russia has also provided the Ortega dictatorship with an array of military equipment, including tanks, armored vehicles, helicopters, fighters, transport aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, patrol craft, and missile boats, among others. Russia has set up ground stations for its GLONASS satellite system in Nicaragua's Najapa Lagoon. It has established a training facility, as noted, in Managua, which in its first year alone conducted 12 courses, giving Russia access to 236 security personnel from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, as well as Nicaragua. Russia is conducting information warfare activities, as noted, oriented towards increasing polarization and decreasing confidence in democratic institutions in the Western Hemisphere. It is leveraging social media, as noted, such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp, complementing activities by its state disinformation platforms Russia Today and Sputnik. Colombia has accused Russia of attempting to interfere in its own elections. Support for Russia by other regimes has also been troubling. This includes, as is noted, Argentina's Alberto Fernandez, who offered his country as Putin's gateway into Latin America, as well as Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who called NATO's military aid to Ukraine immoral. Brazil's attempt recently announced to purchase, quote, as much Russian oil as possible, undermines U.S. and allied efforts to resist Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Russia's activities in the region also highlight the dangers to U.S. strategic interest posed by anti-U.S. authoritarian regimes close to our homeland. These regimes, specifically Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, have served as Russia's principal enablers for projecting their threats into the region. The good news, is also noted by my colleagues, is that in the short term, Russia's ability to operate in the hemisphere is limited by a narrow set of friends and sectors, as well as the resources Russia is spending in the Ukraine, Western sanctions, and the damage of Russian behavior not only to its political reputation, but also to the appeal of Russia as an arms provider. Yet, it's important to recall that these limits are temporary. Russia's commercial interaction, of course, with the region is minimal. These focus on its agricultural purchases and sales of nitrate-based fertilizer, as well as petroleum activities, although Russia also has some activities in mining, nuclear, construction, and space sectors. Military sales and interactions remain Russia's most important engagement tool, including with U.S. partners such as Peru, Brazil, and Mexico. These partners have Russian equipment in inventory, institutional relationships, and may frankly be open to deepening those relationships with possible near-term changes to our partners' political direction. The detailed recommendations that I provide in my written testimony I would summarize as follows. Number one, heightened intelligence to identify and preempt near-term Russian moves in the region. Importantly, Southcom is often the last in line in the allocation of such resources. Two, enhanced containment of entrenched anti-U.S. regimes through, first of all, sustained sanctions, and second, enhanced security support to the neighbors threatened by them, specifically Colombia, Guyana, and Costa Rica, among others. Third, helping Democrats within at-risk regimes across the hemisphere to succeed in order to avoid the occurrence of more anti-U.S. regimes which would host Russian aggression. Doing so requires resources, in which I would call out the possibility of nearshoring and Representative Green's nearshoring bill, as well as attention and better fact-based messaging on the perils not only of engaging with Russia, but as well as authoritarian populism. Additional resources, regulatory flexibility for U.S. defense engagement in the region, and finally, a public strategy for responding to Russia as well as other challenges in the hemisphere. Thank you, the committee, for your time today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin asking questions. Dr. Rovinsky, you outlined the growth of Russian influence across the region, but I'd like to discuss Nicaragua first. I was proud to sponsor the Renaissance Act, which requires a public report on purchases and agreements entered into by the Nicaraguan government related to the military and intelligence sector. Unfortunately, this report has not been released despite Daniel Ortega's demonstrated openness to military cooperation with Russia. In each of your views, are we doing enough? Are we prioritizing enough what's going on with Russia and in some of these countries? Is there more that the U.S. government can do? Can anybody talk a little bit about that, Dr. Rovinsky? What else can we do to stop this?
Oh, thank you very much, Chairman, for your comments and for sharing your view. I think the United States has a window of opportunities now precisely because of some of the factors that we've been discussing with my other colleagues because of the limited capacity that Russia has now. And I believe in the case of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega did not recognize these two separate republics in Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk. And this is very different from what he did back in 2008 when he was the first one to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, two separate republics in Georgia, and did actually a great help to Vladimir Putin because nobody supported Russia back then. He did not do this at this time. And I think one of the reasons is because Daniel Ortega became accustomed to be rewarded by Russia for doing such kind of things. And Russia has very limited capacities now. From this perspective, I think the renewal of the permission for the Russian troops to arrive in Nicaragua is actually a signal that Daniel Ortega is sending to Moscow, expecting that he might be rewarded for doing this. So once again, I think there is a window of opportunity for the United States, perhaps to see if these diminishing capacities of Russia will provide new opportunities to review the policy towards these allies of Vladimir Putin, because they definitely are well aware that Russia has a very, very diminished opportunities now.
Thank you. Can anyone else add to that? Dr. Ellis?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So for me, three key points. Number one, I think Nicaragua and the Renacer Act, as well as our response to Venezuela, emphasizes the value of containment. I think there are situations in which we may not be able to introduce near-term change to authoritarian regimes. However, there is still a value in containing them because that restricts their ability to engage with Russia and other threat actors. I think number two is recognizing the importance of supporting the neighbors that are threatened. Again, in the case of Nicaragua, realizing the burden that Costa Rica is bearing. And I think number three is just recognizing the very dire straits that a number of countries in the region are in, doubling down to provide democratic solutions to allow regimes in the region to avoid radicalization and authoritarian paths, which would proliferate the types of regimes that we don't like to see in Nicaragua and in Venezuela and elsewhere.
Anyone else? One of the things that really burns me up about Nicaragua is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the amount of money that they get in Nicaragua just before the election. After Nicaragua put all those people in jail that were running against them, and yet the IMF gave something like $340 million just before the election. Obviously, I don't know if they keep track of the money, but I wish they would say where that money went to, because that's just not acceptable, since we are one of the biggest contributor to the IMF in terms of money that we give the IMF. All right, now I'd like the ranking member Green recognized for questions. Congressman Green, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really want to say, first off, to all of our witnesses today, this has just been fantastic testimony. And I thank each of you for what you've shared. looked at your written statements prior. They're detailed. I'm very grateful for your efforts today. In March 22, General Glenn Van Herrick, the commander of NORTHCOM, testified before the Senate that Mexico is among the top countries worldwide with regard to the number of Russian intel guys, basically spies, operating in its territory. How should the United States view these activities in respect to our relationship with Mexico and Russia's relationship with Mexico? And I throw that out there to anyone. Perhaps Mr. Ellis, yes, please.
Yes, Ranking Member Green, thank you very much. I think, first of all, of course, this is something that has historically been the case all the way back to the Cold War, the presence of Russian intelligence operatives, Soviet operatives in Mexico, but it certainly illustrates Russia's recognition of the strategic value of Mexico that close to the U.S. border. I think it also illustrates, without implicating, any Mexican knowledge or collusion in this, first, the difficult foreign policy, and we've seen an increasing turn to the left, not only with AMLO, but also Foreign Minister Barnard, as well as some of the very real concerns of activity by a variety of different groups, especially the expanding power of Sinaloa and Jalisco and other cartels. There's really just a sea of opportunity for Russian illicit actors as well as others to swim in desperately close to our U.S. shore. And I certainly welcome more attention to where things are at with the governability of the Mexican regime and its relationship and the posture of AMLO toward the U.S. And the importance of our cooperation on security affairs that directly affect the U.S. through ties of economics, migration, family, and security.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I agree with Dr. Evan Ellis about the importance of paying closer attention to this kind of the activities. I am afraid many Latin American governments have been reluctant to pay sufficient attention to what Russia's intelligence services have been doing in this part of the world. For example, in Colombia, they eventually managed to identify some of the intelligence activities. But till then, Russian diplomats, Russian intelligence officer using the cover of diplomatic posts were almost openly doing such kind of activities everywhere. And it's also very important to take into consideration that differently, for example, to European countries, in Latin America, Russian diplomatic posts, and Russia has stable diplomatic relations with all Latin American and the Caribbean countries, and they have embassies and consulate throughout the entire region. So these diplomatic posts have been actually doing a lot of things that are not exactly correspond to what the diplomatic activities are. They have been involved in intelligence. They have been involved in disinformation, especially taking into account the fact that in some of the countries, the access to RT, Actualidad, and Sputnik Mundo had been reduced. So they now reinforce their diplomatic post to continue this disinformation campaign. So I think it's important to pay attention to this. Thank you.
So maybe perhaps in writing, if the two of you would send what you think our recommended actions should be, that would be helpful. And I'll let you respond in writing to my office. And we'll get that in the record. Real quickly, because I'm almost out of time, anyone can take this question on. A little concerned about what Russia's doing in Nicaragua with the global positioning system, that the observation satellite. Could someone address that briefly? Perhaps Dr. Ellis, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, while it is a legitimate facility to relate to GLONASS, it also creates other electronic capture opportunities and opportunities for Russian space personnel coordinating with Nicaraguans to operate in the region for other purposes. And so, even though it's legitimate, it does open up the door for certain risks, especially ELINT type of risks.
It's an ISR platform, is basically what you're saying.
For capture as well as for the personnel that allows it to work in the region under the cover of that facility.
Ms. Chairman, I'm out of time, but I know Ms. Marten wanted to answer that. Is it okay if she does? You're muted, Mr. Chairman.
How dare they? You are recognized,
Go ahead, Ms. Marten.
Dr. Martin.
Thank you. I would just agree with what the previous speaker said and add that the Nicaraguan facility is different from the Brazilian facilities, which are open to use by scientists. The one in Nicaragua is closed. It probably is engaged in local spying activity from the installation, as well as things that are related to space-based intelligence collection, just because it is dominated by Russia in an area that is very close to the U.S. Embassy.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Now I recognize Congressman Vladimir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. And I want to echo Congressman Green's comments about the terrific testimony here. And I want to thank everybody for participating and you and Ranking Member Green for holding the hearing in the first place. It's critical that we better understand how Russia is influencing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean as we seek to pursue policies that enable democratization, equity, stability, and justice globally. Dr. Rovinsky, your testimony suggested that Russia's war in Ukraine and its aftermath provide strategic openings to limit Russian influence in several Latin American countries that have historically close ties with Russia. In 2019, the Government Accountability Office issued a report on the impacts of sanctions in Venezuela in a response to a request by the House Foreign Affairs Committee and me. The report found that, among other things, Venezuela's economy deteriorated steadily for nearly a decade, and that decline worsened after the U.S. levied new sanctions in 2015. In what ways would increased diplomacy with Venezuela and easing sanctions drive a wedge between Russia and Venezuela?
Thank you very much for the question. I think, first of all, it is important to take into consideration that Venezuela has been Russia's the most important gateway to Latin America. The Chavista regime provided Russia with plenty of opportunities to engage all other nations as well here in this part of the world. But I think for the regime of Nicolas Maduro now, the opportunities that were provided by Russia, first of all, back in Venezuela in the international organizations, second, to help to avoid the U.S. sanctions and basically acting as a middleman, they now cease to exist because of the difficulties experienced by Russia itself. So I think from this perspective, there is an opportunity that the adjusted policy that may allow, of course, not to recognize Nicolas Maduro as a legitimate president, because he doesn't have this legitimacy. This is the authoritarian regime, but may help to make the conditions for ordinary Venezuelans a little bit easier, and also perhaps also to stop any possibilities for Russia to further engagement, which again are quite limited. And the last but not least important, I think it is necessary to take into account the changes in many other Latin American nations. We have a new government here in Colombia that most likely to change its policy towards Venezuela. So I think the United States has to take into account these changes and elaborate new approach to Venezuela.
Good. Yeah, it sounds so wise. Dr. Marten, your testimony notes that Russia's influence in the region exists but is limited, and that there are steps the U.S. can and should take to further counter Russian influence, such as increasing diplomatic ties and filling ambassadorial posts. When the U.S. hosted the Summit of the Americas, I joined my colleagues in writing a letter to the Biden administration urging that the summit be inclusive of countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, noting that the summit was a moment for the region to come together to address Russia's war in Ukraine, among other global challenges. Do you think our continued isolation of these countries helps to maintain Russia's influence over them? And how might lifting the embargo or restaffing the embassy in Cuba, for example, benefit the U.S. interest of keeping Russian influence at bay?
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's not only Russian influence that we have to be concerned about, but Chinese influence.
Right.
And the evidence is in recent years, China is gaining more influence in both Cuba and Venezuela, for example. And so it's both that we have to worry about. Just on the question of Venezuela in particular, Venezuela now, its assets that are located in Russia, it cannot access. And so that means that it has lost things there. And there's evidence that Venezuelan oil is now a competitor against Russian oil in Asia, as Russian oil has turned away from the European market. And so those are just some ways where economics matters in terms of what's happening. But I would just point out that in each of these cases, the real personal ties between these leaders and Putin are relatively weak. They are really for political motives and for economic motives, not for deep ideological motives. And that means that if we have the opportunity to exchange economic benefits for movement towards democratization and away from human rights problems in these countries, we should seize the moment when Russia is so disabled to have an effort to really win back some of the influence that we had in the region before Russia became so involved in past years, especially around 5 to 10 years ago.
And that would help with China too. Okay, my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks to the witnesses very, very much. I yield back.
Nice. Congressman Pfluger, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me and for holding this hearing. In recent years, we've seen China and Russia rapidly expand their influence throughout Latin America. Russia has propped up authoritarian regimes both in Venezuela and Cuba, and obviously the PRC has been discussed on this particular hearing. The Belt and Road Initiative has been used to expand their aspirations, the Chinese aspirations of undercutting our own national security initiatives and economic interest in this region. And I completely agree with Ranking Member Green and appreciate the bipartisan nature of the nearshoring efforts. But when you look at the brazen display of soft power by both countries, I think it should alarm every single member of this committee and should be the sense of Congress that we do and take every action possible to. The steps I've taken recently to address the malign influence of Russia is working with Representative Panetta on introducing legislation that would require the DoD to examine in great detail how Russia is using PMCs across the globe to achieve their strategic objectives. And the direct or indirect threats that Russian PMCs present to our interest and identifying whether or not sanctions on these groups are actually impeding or having a positive effect on deterring their behavior. I'm proud to see that this legislation has made its way through the NDAA and was passed in the House version. I hope it's included in the conference report this year. But this information is going to be vital to understanding these emerging threats. So I'll start with Dr. Ellis. Thank you for your service and thank you for to all the witnesses today. Dr. Ellis, how would you characterize the Russian PMC activities and their objectives in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Sir, first of all, I thank you for the question, U.S. Army civilian. So, across the board, I see a variety of different companies when we talk about the Wagner Group companies. Obviously, I think there's a mixture of support for private interests, the oligarchs that my colleague mentioned, as well as support to strategic objectives. Oftentimes, when Russia wants to avoid doing so directly, committing military forces, and yet at the same time, we see that Russia has also directly committed military forces in places like Venezuela. So, I think. The thing that I think is also important to recognize is there's a synergy, as was alluded to, between Chinese activity and Russia. And I think it's important for the committee to recognize specifically that China oftentimes does not want to be tainted with anti-U.S. activities or the anti-U.S. Work of the regimes, and yet Chinese money in pursuit of its own interests enables those regimes to survive. It lent over $64 billion to Venezuela, over $13 billion to Ecuador under Rafael Correa, et cetera, et cetera. But then in turn, that has given those regimes the open door to engage with Russia in ways directly threatening the United States. China then benefits from those threats without being tainted by that. So I think it's important to understand the synergies between the Chinese and the Russian threats as well well as the direct Russian activities, both directly military and through Wagner Group and other companies such as that.
Well, thank you for that. And that's, very disturbing as we look at those synergies to see this axis forming where it's right at our doorstep and we have to compete with it. Let me just open it up here because I know that, you all have kind of talked about some of the military activities. And my question was originally going to be focused on Russia, but because of the synergy discussion there, which I think is great, I'll open it up to anybody. But do you guys see an escalation of sorts happening in Latin America because of the involvement of the United States and our allies with Ukraine, and specifically with regards to military activity or more equipment, just more activity in general? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Representative Flugler. I wanted to comment on your question earlier as well regarding PMCs and their activity in Latin America. It's encouraging to hear that there is legislation pending calling for the DoD to do more research, do more work to understand how these networks operate. I just would also add, it would be probably pretty useful for other civilian agencies to engage simply because they have a set of capacities that may not be available to the DoD, or there may be some limitations in terms of the kinds of research that can be done openly on certain DoD systems. So I just want to put that out there. There's been a lot of discussion today in this conversation and in conversations that we've recently had in other contexts in Congress about what to do about Russia's malign influence vis-a-vis PMSCs generally. And I would say one thing that I think is overlooked when we talk about more and more need for more intelligence is the fact that today you have a real deficit in our intelligence agencies in terms of Russia specialists, people who speak Russian, who understand the region, who understand the military-industrial complex, are dwindling. And that capability, the anemia within the interagency vis-a-vis our understanding of Russia generally has been one reason why we find ourselves now, 8 years on, in a situation where there is a serious crisis in terms of containing the threat from Russia in not just Ukraine, but other parts of the world. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, my time has expired on this round of questioning, but I do represent Goodfellow Air Force Base, which is the largest, the DoD's largest intelligence training base. So I'm going to take this back directly to the base as an opportunity, and appreciate all the witnesses. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Castro, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony today. And before I begin with my questions, I want to emphasize that as we discuss Russia and to a larger extent, China's influence in Latin America and the Caribbean, that we also have to keep in mind the role the United States should play in strengthening our relationships, our own relationship with countries in the region. And our engagement cannot and should not be solely reactive. In fact, if you look back on history, when we've been only reactive, usually we've made poor decisions. And so our engagement has to be sustained, and it has to be cooperative and collaborative. Countries in Latin America and the Caribbean will continue to partner with Russia and China if there is no better alternative that the United States is offering to them. The United States must work to become the better partner, the better choice for assistance and support, especially during these difficult times. And with that context in mind, I want to direct my first question to two witnesses, Dr. Marten and Dr. Rovinsky. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to unprecedented inflation around the world, with rising food and energy prices, particularly impacting Latin America, as seen by recent protests. In response to the economic recession of COVID-19 and the invasion of Ukraine, recent elections in the region point to increasing frustration and anti-incumbency sentiments, as demonstrated by Chile, Colombia, and Honduras. So my first question, how can the United States engage with these countries, particularly new administrations, to make us a preferred partner in recovery from the economic fallout from the war and COVID-19?
Thank you so much for Sorry.
Please, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for the question. One thing that I would say that we could do that's different from what Russia is able to do and from what China is able to do is to focus on high-tech questions that will simultaneously serve our objectives in trying to limit climate change or to mitigate climate change. And one of those examples we're seeing in Brazil right now, which is very much dependent on Russian fertilizer, is an effort to get away from traditional fertilizer use by thinking of high-tech alternatives. And that's something where Silicon Valley would really have an advantage over both Russia and China. And so I think the more that we can be creative in our thinking and look to our own strengths, the more possibilities that we might have.
All right. Please.
Thank you so much for this question. I think in Latin America, and if we see the numbers, still there is a lot of people who like to see the United States engage with Latin America. The numbers actually that Russia and China operate, so if you see the support for Russia and China and Latin America are much smaller. And I think the United States have all the opportunities to, first of all, to show that actually Latin America and the United States have many, many common interests. I think the U.S. somewhat fails in comparison with the strategic communication advance by Russia because there are many things happening. There is a lot of good stuff happening between the United States and Latin America, but simply this kind of information does not reach many Latin Americans. It's absent in the media. So I think if the United States, in cooperation with Latin American partners, can design or at least to strengthen the existing opportunities, it will help a lot to show that actually there are much more that unite Latin America and the Caribbean and the United States that divide them. I think this is the most important. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And as a follow-up to that, I'd love to know your thoughts as well on the role of vaccine diplomacy or so-called vaccine diplomacy, given that a large number of countries in Latin America have been mainly distributing Russia's Sputnik 5 and Sputnik Light vaccines. Please, and I only got about 35 seconds left, please.
Russia really failed in the opportunity it had with the Sputnik 5 vaccine because it first had delivery delays and then it failed to get World Health Organization approval for its vaccine because it was not able to provide the scientific backup concerning its safety and effectiveness. And so I think that was a real opportunity that the United States maybe could have done more on and that we certainly can do more on now by working on our own strengths in international health issues and international vaccine issues to show that we are a good partner.
Well, thank you. And with that, my time is up. And Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Vargas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I hope you can hear me and see me. One of the things that I found interesting, first of all, I want to thank all the witnesses. I, too, was very impressed with their testimony today, both written and oral. One of the things I learned is the limited capacity of Russia in the area. So I went ahead and took a look, as you were speaking, to the GDP of these countries. So the USA, according to the World Bank, in 2022, our GDP will be about $20.94 trillion. Russia's GDP will be $1.483 trillion. China's will be $14.72 trillion. Now, obviously, we have a lot of capacity. We have a lot of ability because of the size of our economy and the influence that we do have and should have. Now, with us trying to contain Russia, as I think we should, there's a lot more that we can do in Latin America and that we should be doing. So I will ask, because I again follow Mr. Castro said, I agree with him. There's so much more. Dr. Marten, what else can we do? I mean, one of the things that did annoy me, just to be frank, every vaccine that we had for COVID should have had the American flag on it. We should have had the American flag, and everyone should have known, when we send a vaccine out, that's coming from the United States of America. We are your friends. I think we blew it in that. I think we were right to be generous in it, but I think we blew it in not putting our flag on it. But what else can we do?
Thank you for the question. I think it would be important to make sure that all of our leading diplomatic roles in the region are filled, because I think ambassadors have a unique role in being able to help business people from the United States in their efforts to make inroads in new places and new sectors. And I think it sends a message that the U.S. cares about those countries and is making them a priority. And so I think the more that our diplomatic representatives can work with U.S. businesses to create new opportunities, the more chance we will have of replacing the Russian influence.
I have to say, one of the things I think that we do well is we send our young people there. My 18-year-old daughter just graduated from high school, and she is with Amigos Las Americas. She's in Latin America right now. It's her second year doing this. My older daughter did it for 5 years, all throughout Latin America, and they love us. I mean, they can't get enough of these young kids and, the spirit that they bring of America. I mean, I think that there's so much more that we can do and we should do. I mean, I think that most countries are anxious, but yes, go ahead, Dr. Martin. Your hand was up.
Just really quickly, Russia has really failed in that because it's been withdrawing its young people from the West. And so I think you're absolutely right that the presence of our young people in different countries is something that is really an unofficial ambassador role that's important.
And I think we should encourage that and do more of that. Again, one of the things that concerns me is China. I travel around Latin America quite a bit myself. China is very involved in Latin America, and they do have resources. As I noted, their economy is big, and they are investing. I mean, obviously, they create the debt trap and they do all sorts of other nefarious things, but they do have the capacity to be there. I have to say, too, it seems from this Ukrainian war, which is such a criminal act, that the Russians are also very incompetent. I mean, they're showing their incompetence here and their backwardness, even in the way they fight. So I obviously I think it's a good idea that we focus on them, but not to lose the focus on China, because I think China is doing even more nefarious things. I don't know. Does anyone have a comment on that? Yes, I see your hand up, Mr. Ellis, I believe. Dr. Ellis.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I think I want to pull together some very important threads that you brought up. Number one, that Russia, because of its lack of resources, really is not going to be able to come substantially to the aid of its close partners that are looking to it: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. As a matter of fact, Latin America only exported about $6 billion to Russia last year, is by comparison to over $140 billion to China. So Latin Americans clearly look much more to China as a market and for resources. What that means is that Russia really has two options. One is that its ability to act in the region will probably center more around threats, which is why I focused on the intelligence to projecting short-term limited threats designed against the U.S. But number two, those basically anti-U.S. regimes will be then driven to focus more on China for those resources, and we have to give them options against doing that. And then finally, there is a whole basket of regimes because of COVID-19, as well as the inflationary effects of Russia's Ukraine invasion, that are facing severe fiscal constraints and the inability to cover at-risk populations. And so my big concern is that many of those states, which may be left or right, but are still basically democratic, that we help to ensure that those struggles that are going on in places like Peru or where things are going with Chile potentially later in the year with the Boric administration, et cetera, where things could go with Colombia, to make sure that those states that we help them to succeed economically through things like investment, through things like nearshoring, through things like fiscal support, to help them avoid that anti-U.S. path that comes from radicalization, which will proliferate the problems that we face. And to me, in that way, our economic engagement helps keep China's bay as well as keeping Russia at bay.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I appreciate you very much. I yield back, sir.
Thank you very much, Congressman Vargas. I have a question before I do closing, and if any other members wish to ask a second question, please feel free to do so. My question is this, and I would love to hear a comment.
We lost the chairman for a second here.
For
Yeah, okay. I want to make sure.
Witnesses that are here It is noticeable, very, very noticeable, that the countries where Russia has the most influence have the worst human rights records, from political imprisonment to attacks on independent journalists, to shutting down humanitarian NGOs. And look at specifically at Cuba. They had a demonstration this year. The Cuban government is, excuse me? Oh, my video's been, did you hear the question? Can you just nod if you heard the question? I guess not. Hello? Can you just raise your hand if you can hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, Jesus. Oh, I don't like this. Can anybody hear me? Can you
Congressman,
hear me?
repeat your question potentially.
Well, how do
for the
we get it
witnesses.
back?
Sorry for the delay, everyone. Some tech issues.
Can you hear me?
Mr. Chairman, we
Okay.
hear you seldomly. You break up almost all the time. Very, very difficult to hear. Every so often, a word or two, but not strung together in any sort of syntax that I think anybody can understand.
One, I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me clearly now? Yeah. All right. We'll try this again. It is notable to me that the countries where Russia has the most influence have the worst human rights records, from political imprisonment to attacks on independent journalists to shutting down humanitarian NGOs. Just recently, Cuba had a demonstration where people went to the streets. They're giving kids 10 years prison for demonstrating. How do we inform other countries that this is what Russia really offers? How do we do that? I mean, you got to be blind not to see what Russia offers, because they have really nothing but, devastation to offer. Can each and one of you say a little bit something about that before we close? Candace?
Thank you, Chair Sears. I'll just briefly comment. All of this testimony today has, I think, provoked a lot of thinking about what is needed to resource the effort to combat Russia's influence in Latin America and other parts of the world. And I think, again, I would just repeat that investment in the architecture, the institutional architecture, in order to support that effort is going to be very key, not just the engagement piece and all the kind of tactical and strategic things that have been described by my colleagues here. Clearly, during the Cold War, there was an enormous amount of investment in education of specialists in Russian affairs, as well as specialists who could be sort of a bridge between specialists in the area of military and security affairs, and also diplomacy in all kinds of regions of the world, including in Latin America. I would note that also during the Cold War, the Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were extremely important in influencing outcomes in Eastern Europe and Europe writ large, for sure. We don't see anything comparable to that today in terms of investment in the infrastructure needed to actually have influence over these outcomes, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. There is no comparable body like RFE-RL And I think that that certainly is a deficit that probably should be addressed relatively soon if you want to get to grips with the disinformation campaign and the ways in which RT and Sputnik are managing to influence opinion in the area. But I would just repeat again, it is all nice and well and good to name all the different things that need to be done, but you have to have the people and the resources to do it. And right now, it's not there.
Thank you. Dr. Marten, can you comment on that?
I agree with Candace Rondeaux completely. I have noticed the deficit of funding for people who specialize in Russian studies. And also what we really need to do is tell people in Spanish and Portuguese language broadcasts exactly what Putin and his regime have done in terms of their corruption and their violence. And so I agree completely that what we need to do is answer back. And let me just add one more thing from a previous question, the question about whether sanctions against the Wagner Group work. I think they do. I think they limit the geographic regions where Wagner can be deployed. As Candace Rondeaux has noted in her previous work, there are people who are employed by Wagner who are also employed by Rosneft, the oil industry, but they're different people. They're doing different things, and Wagner is much worse than Rosneft. And so I think by having sanctions against Wagner, we are limiting the really nefarious actions of Russia. I'm more familiar with Africa on this than Latin America, but I think it applies there as well.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis.
Yes. So first of all, I think in general, most of the states that are siding strongly with Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, et cetera, as you pointed out, themselves do not have free presses and are notable violators. I think the states that we find in the middle, Brazil, Argentina, we have options to encourage more the thinking about democracy. But in addition to the fact that I think we need a more forceful, not only resources, but a communication strategy that would come from the State Department, public diplomacy, from the GEC, from GFC and other entities like that. But I think in addition to that, we need to rebuild the messaging that, what is the value of a democracy? What is the value of free markets? And, to get our own partners in the region to be repeating that. I mean, to me, it was a shame that at the Summit of the Americas, this idea of, we are no longer just we started out as a club of democracies, but we lost the idea that it's a club you get to show up just because you're in the hemisphere. And so we need to get our partners to be willing to stand up for the democracy because they believe that there's value in it for them as the way to develop and have benefit for their societies. And we need to see people in Latin America to see that clear benefit as well.
Thank you, Dr. Rovinsky.
Thank you very much. I agree completely with my colleagues, but I would like to add just two specific points. I think one of the ways to expose the nature of Russia's authoritarian regime and severe violation of human rights committed by Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia itself, is through investigative journalism. The investigative journalism has been very effective in Europe, for example, to exposing the corruption, the other wrongdoings by those regimes that are friendly to Russia. And we do know there has been a very important academic research on this topic in Latin America, but there has been no investigative journalist report on that kind of relations between Russia and those regimes. And last but not least, of course, civil society. This is very important, the support to civil society in democratic countries of Latin America that are actually the key allies for the democratic forces in this part of the world. Thank you.
Look, this has been a very informative hearing, and I thank the witness for your comments. I really enjoyed this hearing, and I want to thank my colleagues that joined us for this important hearing. And now we would go to closing, and thank you again to our witnesses and the members for joining us on this important hearing. Over the last decade, Putin has sought to increase his influence in the Western Hemisphere through a variety of techniques, including arms sales, trade, and propaganda. By remaining engaged with our neighbors in the region, we can counter that influence. Today's hearing should be just one part of a comprehensive strategy to protect U.S. interests and support principles that we all value. I look forward to working with my colleagues to build on the discussion we had today. With that, The committee is adjourned. Thank you very much to our witnesses.